Adana screamed into the night, her wails mixing with the roar of the waters. But her child was gone, swallowed by the river's fury. Overcome with grief, she stumbled through the thick underbrush of the forest, her heart hollow with loss. The forest was a cruel, unforgiving place. Each day felt like a battle for survival, against the relentless rain, the wild animals, and the merciless cold that cut into her bones at night. Her feet, bare and bloodied, trod paths few dared to walk. Yet she wandered deeper into the forest, driven by the slim, desperate hope that perhaps Nana was still alive. Each day blurred into the next. Adana's world became the rustling of leaves and the gurgle of streams, the distant call of birds, and the occasional growl of predators. The scent of moss and damp earth clung to her skin, and her once beautiful hair tangled into a wild mess. She spoke to the trees, to the spirits of the forest, begging for a sign, a glimpse, a whisper of her child. But the forest remained silent, offering no comfort. Sometimes, in her dreams, she saw Nana, floating down the river, her little body cradled by the currents. In these dreams, Adana ran, reaching for her, but always too late. She would wake with a scream, her hands grasping at nothing but cold, empty air. She was no longer whole, no longer the woman she had once been. Her soul felt hollow as the weight of guilt consumed her, knowing she had left her child alone for just a brief moment. It was enough for fate to steal Nana away. For 2 seasons, Adana wandered the forest, driven by despair. She called Nana's name, searched every corner of the woods, but the forest was silent. As time passed, she grew weaker, but her will to find her daughter kept her on her feet. With no reason to return to Baser, the kingdom that once held her heart, Adana let herself drift further into the forest. The villages she visited were unwelcoming. Her once beautiful appearance was now wild and ragged, her hair tangled with leaves and twigs, and her eyes darkened by grief. The people whispered cruel names behind her back, the madwoman, the cursed one, while others openly shunned her, throwing scraps when she begged for food. Some days, when the pain of losing Nana became unbearable, she fled back to the forest, punishing herself by reliving that day over and over. During one of her many retreats into the forest, Adana stumbled upon something strange. The forest canopy opened into new land, a village surrounded by tall trees. Budo, the forgotten kingdom. As she walked into the village, she noticed how the people whispered. Their faces paled with curiosity, but not hostility. Adana had entered Budo, an ancient land cursed and trapped by its own greed. Generations ago, Budo had been a thriving, wealthy kingdom. Its land was rich with gemstones and treasures, but famine had come, and the king had made a desperate pact with the gods for fertile harvests, and his queen had asked for a child, an heir to the throne, and the goddess of fertility granted her wish. But when the time came to fulfill the wishes of the gods by sharing their treasures with neighboring kingdoms, greed overtook the king. He lied to the gods 3 different times. Enraged, the gods cursed the land. Budo would remain rich, but its wealth would be useless. None could leave the village, for the forest would swallow anyone who dared cross its borders. And so, the people of Budo slowly dwindled, forgotten by the outside world, their rich fields barren, their gold worthless. Adana's arrival stirred whispers in Budo. Could she be the one to lift the curse? No one had ventured through the forest and returned for decades. And yet, here she stood. The king summoned her to the palace. His chiefs questioned her about how she passed through the cursed forest. But Adana didn't understand. To her, it was just another part of her endless wandering. That night, 5 of Budo's bravest men entered the forest, eager to test whether the curse had indeed been broken. 2 never returned. The remaining 3 were found at the village's edge, traumatized and unable to speak of what they had seen. Adana, meanwhile, remained in Budo, her grief pulling her in deeper. But soon, her eyes took in the suffering of the people, their hunger despite their riches. And an idea took root in her mind. She was the daughter of a farmer after all. She started small, gathering grains and planting them in fertile patches she found within the forest. She hunted, bringing back small animals to trade with the villagers for their gold and gemstones. But when she brought her first batch of produce to the market, grains, vegetables, and meat she had hunted, no one wanted to buy from her. They were afraid to buy from the witch of the forest, the madwoman who talked to herself. They sent her away, telling her that her food was cursed. Only one man, Chief Chigbo, and his wife stood against the crowd. The chief's wife approached Adana and, to the shock of many, purchased some of her produce. "We have been asking for a way through the forest for years," Chief Chigbo declared, "and now that the fruits of the forest have come to us, we will reject them." He bought a portion himself, and the villagers watched, anxious and waiting for what the night would bring. By morning, a crowd had gathered at the door of Chief Chigbo's house, waiting to see if the food had cursed him and his family. But when the chief and his wife emerged, healthy and smiling, the villagers were filled with relief. They rushed to Adana in the market, buying all she had brought and begging her to bring more. News of her success reached the palace, and the king soon requested that Adana bring fresh produce to the royal kitchens. From that day on, Adana became highly sought after in Budo. Though the villagers still had their reservations, they knew they needed her. Her hunts and harvests from the forest were essential, and the people began to rely on her. Grateful for the kindness shown by Chief Chigbo and his wife, Adana often saved the best portions of her grains, vegetables, and meat for them. Yet not everyone was pleased with Adana's rise. Queen Oladi, stepmother of Prince Jano, the wife of King Ikam of Budo, grew jealous. The king spoke often of Adana's skills, praising her for what she had done for the village. Oladi, whose marriage to the king had been one of convenience after the death of Jano's mother, grew spiteful. She began whispering to the palace staff and courtiers, spreading rumors that Adana's power over the forest made her dangerous. Her jealousy reached its peak one day when young Jano, the heir to the throne, went missing. Jano had wandered into the forest after a harsh argument with the queen, who often berated him with cruel words. When Jano didn't return by nightfall, the queen seized the opportunity. She convinced the king that Adana must have taken the boy. Panic gripped the king's heart, and he ordered his guards to search the village for Adana. They scoured Chief Chigbo's house, but his wife defended Adana, explaining that she had gone into the forest days ago to gather grains and meat at her request. When Adana returned from the forest, the queen expected her to be arrested. Instead, the king, desperate and humbled, approached her with a plea. "Find my son," he begged. "Bring Jano back to me." Adana entered the forest once more. For 2 days, she searched, and on the morning of the third, she emerged from the shadows, Jano safely at her side. The villagers celebrated, but whispers of Adana being a spirit or a witch persisted. That evening, Chief Chigbo's wife invited her to her home. "You've done enough wandering, child," she said gently, leading Adana to a small basin of water. "Let me help you clean up." Adana hesitated at first, but finally relented. As she washed away the dirt and exhaustion of her endless search for Nana, her natural beauty began to reemerge. Her skin, once dulled by grief and weather, now gleamed with warmth. Her hair, once tangled with leaves and twigs, was brushed and tied back neatly, revealing her sharp, elegant features. Her eyes, though still carrying the weight of her past, shone with a newfound clarity. Chief Chigbo's wife offered her embellished clothes fit for a lady of the palace, but Adana shook her head. I need something simple, she insisted. Something I can hunt and move freely in. She chose a plain yet striking garment. When she emerged from the house, the villagers who had once called her madwoman stood in awe. They whispered among themselves, astonished that the woman they had shunned was so strikingly beautiful. After his rescue, the young Prince Jano became her friend. He followed her wherever she went, sitting with her at the outskirts of the forest as she told him stories. Despite his stepmother's warnings, Jano couldn't stay away from Adana. She reminded him of the mother he had lost, and Adana, who had once lost everything, found herself growing fond of the boy. One evening, as the fire crackled softly at the outskirts of the forest, Jano sat beside Adana, their usual spot, as she told him some epic Afro tales, and then the sound of footsteps interrupted them. King Ecom emerged from the shadows. "Jano," he said gently, "it's late. You should return to the palace." Jano glanced between his father and Adana, sensing an unspoken connection. Reluctantly, he nodded and left them alone by the fire. Once Jano had gone, the king sat beside Adana, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Adana," he began, his voice tender, "I cannot deny what I feel for you. You have captured my heart." He took her hand in his, and she met his gaze, her own feelings rising to the surface. "I feel the same," she whispered, her voice soft but sure. That night, under the starlit sky, their love blossomed. They laid together on the soft earth, the warmth of their bodies a rare comfort amidst the cold, cursed land of Budo. The king, overwhelmed by his feelings, began to visit Adana frequently, their meetings hidden beneath the cover of night. In time, King Ecom asked Adana to marry him, eager to make her his queen. But Adana, though she loved him, refused. "I cannot be queen," she said softly. "My place is in the forest. That's where I feel safe." He didn't understand, but he respected her decision. Their love remained strong, and they continued to meet at the small hut she had built deep in the woods. It was there one night that the king presented her with a gift, a golden egg, intricately carved with symbols of the land. "This," he said, "is more valuable than anything in Budo. It's a symbol of my love for you." Adana held the egg close, valuing it above all the riches she had ever seen. It became her most prized possession, a token of their secret love. Queen Oladi soon discovered where the king disappeared to every night, and her jealousy burned. But there was little she could do. King Ecom, after all, was entitled to many wives, and though Adana refused the title of queen, the bond they shared was undeniable. Still, the queen seethed in silence, plotting her next move as the love between Adana and the king only grew stronger. As Jano grew older, he wanted to help his people break the curse that bound Budo. He clung to Adana, hoping she held the key. Together, they ventured deeper into the woods, with Jano taking on more of the tasks Adana once did. She had become one of them, and they had become her people. Jano was like a son to her, and she was like a mother to him. One day, while hunting in the forest, Jano felt something strange. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the trees whispering warnings he couldn't understand. Then out of the shadows a spirit appeared, a figure cloaked in mist, its form shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. Its eyes, glowing with ancient power, locked onto Jano, freezing him in place. "Who dares to enter this sacred place?" The spirit's voice echoed, cold and unforgiving. Jano, trembling but resolute, stood tall. "I am Jano of Budo, son of King Ecom." "Who are you?" "I am one of the guardian of the forest, keeper of its secrets," the spirit hissed. "You do not belong here, child of the cursed land." The spirit surged forward, and Jano raised his arms in defense. But as the spirit loomed, something held it back. It circled him, its ethereal form floating around like a shadow. Then it paused, hovering before him. "Who is your mother?" the spirit demanded. "My mother is dead," Jano replied, his voice shaking. The spirit's eyes narrowed. "Then who do you call mother?" Jano hesitated, but only for a moment. "Adana of Baser," he shouted, the name leaving his lips with a strange sense of finality. The spirit recoiled, its misty form rippling. "Adana of Baser," it repeated softly, as if tasting the name. "You are spared for her sake." The spirit began to retreat, its shape dissolving into the air. But Jano, desperate, lunged forward, grabbing onto the wisps of its form. "Wait," he pleaded, his voice full of urgency. "When will the curse on Budo be lifted?" The spirit's form quivered as it turned toward Jano, its voice heavy with ancient sorrow. "The curse was placed by the mightiest god of the lands and the goddess of fertility. I do not know when it will be lifted, but—" The spirit paused, a strange look in its eyes. "I have heard whispers from our realms. They speak of a unifier. Only when the unifier comes will the curse be broken." Jano's grip tightened. "Who is the unifier? Where can I find them?" But the spirit offered no more answers. It faded into the night, leaving Jano standing alone, the cryptic message swirling in his mind. Jano returned to Adana, who, though aged, carried a beauty that time could not diminish. Her face, now lined with the wisdom and trials of the years, had a serene grace. The silver strands in her hair shimmered in the firelight, giving her the appearance of an ancient queen, dignified and strong. Her eyes, though touched with the weight of sorrow, held the same depth of warmth and compassion that had always drawn people to her. She had aged beautifully, her beauty now more refined, like a river stone smoothed by years of endurance. As they sat by the fire, Jano, still shaken by the spirit's words, recounted his encounter in the forest. Adana listened, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of it. When Jano finished, a deep silence hung between them, only the crackle of the fire breaking the stillness. Then, with a quiet sigh, Adana spoke, her voice filled with the burden of a story long kept hidden. She shared with Jano her past, of Baser, of Prince Obi, and of the daughter she had lost so many years ago. Her voice trembled as she spoke of Nana, the child she had searched for endlessly, but never found. Tears flowed freely down her face, tracing the fine lines etched by time, as the memories of her lost daughter came rushing back, raw and painful. Jano, seeing this, reached out to comfort her, understanding that beneath the beauty she still carried, there was a heart scarred by immeasurable loss. Meanwhile, in the distant kingdom of Baser, Nana sat in the palace, haunted by thoughts of her mother. One day, desperate for answers, she sought out the chief priest. "Is my mother alive?" she asked. The priest nodded gravely. "Yes," she said. "Your mother lives." Nana's heart soared with hope. She vowed that she would find her mother, no matter the cost.